If you enjoy stories that are strange, dark, and mysterious, you're in the right place. Here, chilling narratives uncover unsettling mysteries and eerie details that will stay with you long after listening. The stories from the phone that should never ring inside Colorado's abandoned hospital. Local workers often talked about a sealed hospital in a remote part of Colorado where a single desk phone still rang. Archived notes from old security shifts suggested that the line kept signaling even after contractors removed most of the wiring. The story grew inside small crews that handled empty properties, and many avoided that building altogether. Ryland Mercer worked as a maintenance inspector in his late 30s and took temporary assignments whenever firms needed quick reports. He arrived at the abandoned hospital during a cool afternoon because the property company wanted structural information before planning future renovations. Rylan expected an easy job since his checklist focused on doors, ceilings, and leftover electrical conduits that rarely caused trouble. He pushed through the front entrance and found a stale smell drifting through the hallway that felt heavier than normal indoor dust. His flashlight gave a steady but muted beam as he moved across cracked tiles and old lines painted decades earlier. Ryland recorded audio notes with a small handheld recorder because the firm preferred clean voice logs over written descriptions. Before we dive into tonight's story, take a moment and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it fascinating to see who's out there, tuning in from different corners of the world. The administrative wing sat on the far right side of the building with a maze of desks coated in a dense layer of dirt. A rotary phone rested on a sagging table near a boarded window, and several previous workers claimed it still rang despite having no live connection. Ryland glanced at the cord and saw that it trailed into a split opening where the panel clearly showed missing wires. He continued walking and described a collapsed drywall section that bowed outward in a way suggesting a slow, long-term leak. His flashlight flickered slightly as he checked a rusted hinge on an unused emergency door and explained the damage into the recorder. Ryland felt uneasy without knowing why, because everything seemed typical for an older facility. The first ring echoed through the corridor while he photographed a bent metal frame supporting a loose ceiling panel. The sound seemed unnaturally clear because the hallway absorbed most noise, and the phone sat far from his current position. Ryland stopped talking for several seconds as the ring bounced against the walls in a sharp, rhythmic pattern. He returned to the administrative wing and saw the rotary phone vibrating lightly against the dusty table as it rang again. His recorder picked up the echo behind him and confirmed that the noise matched earlier descriptions from maintenance crews. Ryland felt drawn to the phone out of simple curiosity because he knew the line should not have been active. He answered with a tense greeting and heard faint breathing mixed with static that sounded filtered through a weak old amplifier. A voice said his name very quietly, and Rylan asked who was speaking while trying to stay calm in an empty building. The connection broke in mid-sentence, and the receiver went silent without the usual click of a completed call. Rylan placed the receiver back and checked the entry point of the cable because he wanted proof that no live wiring remained. He spoke into the recorder, stating that the line had no visible power source and that the call held no clear origin. His focus narrowed because he wanted a logical explanation before reporting anything unusual. As he walked toward another wing, he noticed a set of fresh footprints in the dust leading from the old operating corridor toward a locked elevator. The prints appeared crisp and recently made because they cut into the dust in tight, straight edges without any smearing. Ryland followed them cautiously and kept his flashlight aimed low to document every detail. The trail stopped near the elevator where scratched lines marked the metal surface beside the faded control panel. His recorder captured his slow breathing while he described the prints as belonging to a single person with a narrow shoe size. Ryland felt tension rise because he had not seen any signs of an active trespasser when he entered earlier. The phone rang again with the same piercing clarity that seemed to travel through the hallway stronger than any normal sound. Ryland hesitated at first, but decided to return because ignoring a second call felt reckless given the recent evidence. He reached the table and answered the phone with a steady voice he did not fully feel. A different voice spoke with a flat tone, suggesting neither emotion nor urgency, and warned him not to stay inside much longer. The warning referenced shifting support beams that supposedly reacted to late-day temperature changes documented by earlier staff. Rylan asked where the caller learned that information, but the call cut out before he received an answer. He checked the cord again and confirmed no wiring connected the line to any active system. His pulse spiked as he realized that both calls came through a phone that had no operational link to outside networks. Rylan logged the event and noted that the voice quality carried a slight metallic hum similar to outdated switchboard equipment. He prepared to leave, but reviewed his photos first and noticed something unfamiliar in one frame near the elevator. A faint blurred outline appeared behind the dust trail and looked like a person standing slightly to the left of the frame. Rylan compared it to the next image that showed an empty hallway without the unclear shape. His flashlight began to dim quicker than expected as he walked toward the exit, and small vibrations traveled through the floor near the lobby. The air felt warmer inside than outside, even though he had kept the door open earlier to ventilate the entry area. Rylan moved faster and pushed through the doors into open air that cooled his skin immediately. He replayed the recorded phone calls near his truck and heard fragments of each voice mixed with grainy distortion. One segment carried a subtle tone resembling distant mechanical clicking that did not match any modern communication device. Rylan saved everything to a backup drive and completed a final audio note before leaving the area. The property company reviewed his materials during the following week and compared his findings with archived inspection reports from previous contractors. Several entries mentioned unexplained phone activity near the same administrative wing and noted voices calling workers by name. Another document described footprints appearing overnight in dust patterns that matched Rylan's observations near the elevator. Redevelopment plans were postponed because structural engineers requested additional safety evaluations before allowing anyone deeper access. The follow-up team reported no fresh footprints and no ringing phone during their brief daylight visit. Rylan read their summary and felt uneasy because many variables did not align with the standard abandoned building profile. He rarely revisits the audio recordings because the static-filled voices create a heavy, uncomfortable memory whenever he hears them. The strange part for him is the tone used during the second call, because it sounded like a calm warning conveyed without clear intent. Rylan now tells coworkers that some buildings hold on to their history in ways people do not fully understand. The abandoned hospital remains sealed to this day, and the rotary phone still sits on the same table under a layer of settled dust. No further calls were documented, although local rumors continue to rise whenever new workers hear fragments of old stories. Rylan avoids that area completely because he does not want to answer that phone ever again. The stories of the missing signs carved deep in the Alabama pines. Rangers across Alabama still mention a strange incident from the late 1990s that involved a set of carved trail marks found deep inside a quiet pine belt. They say the marks seemed simple at first, yet they kept showing up in the same remote area with no clear purpose or owner. Their reports later shaped a case that stayed unofficial because nothing about it fit clean categories and nothing ever reached a clean ending. Rhett Mallory worked as a highway maintenance tech and spent his days checking rural pull-offs for damaged signs. He was 30 years old with a steady routine, and he rarely deviated from his route. He started one warm afternoon planning to inspect a short service road that cut into an isolated pine stretch south of a small Alabama town. He figured he would finish before sunset and head home for dinner because the job looked easy from the initial assignment sheets. He walked past a gravel turnout and entered the first row of pines where he spotted a fresh mark on a trunk that caught his attention. The cut ran longer than his hand, with a sharp angle at the top and a strange depth that did not match normal survey instructions. He guessed a logging crew might have placed it for direction, although he had never seen that shape used for anything related to forestry work. The tree looked healthy, which meant the mark was intentional rather than natural. Rhett stepped deeper into the trees and found a second mark carved at nearly the same height as the first. The shape matched exactly, which made him pause, because identical marks in that pattern usually meant an organized plan rather than a casual carving. He wrote a quick note in his pocketbook that the sign might be tied to old boundary work that predated updated district records. He tried to call his supervisor on his radio, but the signal broke repeatedly, which forced him to move without confirmation. A narrow path appeared after the second mark
and the ground showed a line of pressed leaves that looked recently disturbed. Rhett checked the soil and found faint depressions that could have been boot prints, although the pattern was too smudged to confirm. He saw a torn scrap of orange cloth stuck to a low branch near the path, and the fabric looked faded from sunlight. That detail pushed him forward because the cloth did not match anything worn by crews assigned to that part of Alabama in those years. The path curved and the pines closed in around him as he followed the marks toward a darker section of the forest. Witness statements gathered later from a few nearby residents mentioned missing pets in that era, which connected loosely to the disturbed ground Red observed. He found a small length of tangled wire under a cluster of needles, which suggested a snare or trap that had been left behind by someone who knew the area well. He photographed the wire and wrote that the setup felt amateur rather than professional, which made the situation more confusing. Half a mile in, he reached a shallow clearing shaped like a bowl where the trees bent outward. The center held an old plastic cooler without a lid. A ring of pale stones surrounded it in a layout that seemed deliberate but not symbolic in any recognizable way. Rhett crouched and checked the interior of the cooler, where he found a sheet of lined paper folded under a rock. The paper carried a single word written in shaky letters: missing. The ink had bled slightly from moisture, which implied the note had been there for several days at least. Rhett remembered seeing a faded poster on a bulletin board near a grocery store in a nearby Alabama town. The poster mentioned a teenager who disappeared in the summer of 1998 after telling friends he wanted to check a shortcut through a pine stand. None of the reports mentioned carved trail marks or unusual objects left in clearings. Rhett felt a heavy sense of unease as he folded the paper and stored it carefully inside his notebook because he needed to document everything for his shift report. He turned toward the path and noticed a third mark on a thick trunk near the clearing. This mark looked newer because the bark around the cut still held moisture. He traced the groove with his glove and realized the angle matched the earlier marks with perfect consistency. That detail suggested a methodical pattern, although the reason behind it remained unclear. He took a photo and recorded that the tree still smelled of fresh sap, which helped approximate the timing of the carving. Rhett tried the radio again, but only received static, mixed with brief bursts of broken audio that made no sense. He decided to follow the fresh mark because it seemed like the next logical step in understanding the pattern. The air felt heavier as he moved deeper, and the sound of insects faded, which he found odd for that part of Alabama. He kept walking with slow steps because the path narrowed and the trees pressed tightly from both sides. He reached another small rise where the soil changed from sandy to soft red clay. A row of footprints appeared along the slope, and these impressions looked clearer because the clay held shape well. The prints seemed small and narrow, which matched the size of a lightweight adult or older teen. Rhett photographed the prints and noted that the stride length did not show signs of panic, which made the trail even stranger. Whoever walked that route had moved with calm steps that suggested familiarity with the terrain. At the top of the rise, he found a fallen branch with a strip of duct tape wrapped around one end. The tape carried dark smudges that looked like dried dirt or residue from handling. He checked the ground near the branch and found a shallow indentation shaped like a knee print. That meant someone had stopped and knelt there at some point. Rhett wrote that detail because he knew investigators would want every point of contact documented. The path shifted left and revealed a small depression surrounded by tall pines with a single log placed across the center. Something about the placement looked intentional, as though someone used it as a makeshift seat. Rhett sat briefly to observe the area and noticed a piece of thin cord wrapped around the base of a nearby sapling. The cord ended in a frayed tip, which suggested it had been cut quickly. He added the cord to his bag because it qualified as trace material relevant to the notes he had collected. As the light faded, he realized he needed to turn back, but a final mark appeared on a tree just beyond the depression. This mark stretched wider than the others, and the bark around it held a smear of dark residue that did not match sap or soil. Rhett felt a sharp sense of caution as he approached it, because the smear looked like it had been dragged across the surface by a human hand. He photographed it, but did not touch it. He stepped back toward the path, and something caught his peripheral vision. A bundle of branches leaned against a trunk near the last mark, and the shape resembled a makeshift shelter frame. The structure looked abandoned, yet stable enough to have been used recently. Rhett scanned the ground and spotted a second sheet of lined paper pinned under a stick. This sheet carried a short line of writing in the same shaky hand as the earlier note. It said that someone had been watching the pines for years. Rhett felt an urgent need to leave as the temperature dropped sharply under the canopy. He backed away slowly and followed the earlier marks out of the clearing until he reached the original turnout. His radio picked up signal again as soon as he stepped onto open ground. He made a detailed report that night and submitted the photos to his supervisor along with both notes and the cord. A search team later walked the path but found fewer marks than Rhett described, which created confusion about the timeline and the state of the trail. Archived logs show that the missing teenager's case never progressed beyond speculative leads. The connection between the notes and the footprints remained inconclusive because nothing else surfaced from that section of Alabama. Rhett continued to work in the region for several years, yet he never again saw a mark that matched the sharp angles he found that day. Some rangers say the markings were part of an old signal system used by a small group that camped illegally in the pines during those years. Others say they were tied to a private search effort that never went public. Rhett never pushed for answers because he decided the most reasonable choice was to avoid that path altogether. He later said that the quiet tension in the air felt heavier than anything he had experienced on duty. He told newer techs to steer clear of carved marks that seemed too clean or too evenly spaced because signs like that usually connect to someone with a plan. The clearing still exists somewhere inside those Alabama pines, but the stones and the cooler have never been logged again by any crew. The story's buried under an Arizona diner. In a small Arizona town, there were scattered reports from 1995 that pointed toward one diner basement, where a slow series of odd events unsettled the staff. Locals later said the incident never turned into anything dramatic, yet every archived note kept circling back to one cook whose early shifts placed her closest to the problem. The diner stood near a quiet stretch of highway, which meant most customers focused on their meals and rarely thought about the older structure supporting the kitchen above them. During a warm morning in mid-1995, a 32-year-old cook named Lois Hargrove unlocked the back door before sunrise and stepped inside with her usual quiet routine. She wanted to finish her prep work early because the manager planned to start a deep clean that afternoon and needed her help with the basement shelves. The building felt cooler than usual that morning because the desert night air had settled inside the basement, which gave the space a sharp temperature contrast that Lois noticed as soon as she reached the stairs. She walked down the narrow stairwell with a small flashlight clipped to her apron, since one ceiling bulb flickered whenever the weather changed. She reached the final step when the bulb above her snapped with a sharp pop that left half the room dim and uneven. Lois paused long enough for her eyes to adjust before continuing because she had dealt with the same bulb for weeks and planned to replace it before the lunch rush. Her morning shifted in tone when she spotted the inventory clipboard sitting on a crate near the far wall. Lois always stored that clipboard in a locked drawer upstairs after final counts, and she remembered locking it the night before. She opened the top sheet and found a short sentence in jagged handwriting that read, "Check the second shelf again," which matched no one on staff. When she showed it to the manager, he insisted a careless busser likely borrowed the clipboard without returning it properly, but Lois knew the drawer had been locked. More strange details appeared over the next several days, and each one surfaced from different people working different shifts. A delivery driver said he heard a heavy thump under the floor during an early drop-off when the building was otherwise silent. A dishwasher mentioned smelling something like burnt rubber near the basement door, even though nothing had been cooked for hours. A young server confessed that several canned goods were lined in a new pattern she had never seen before, and the shift logs showed no reason for anyone to reorganize them. Lois decided to track everything herself by photographing shelf positions at closing time. She placed small strips of tape along the front edges to note exact spacing. When she returned the next morning, several cans had shifted by a few inches, despite the building staying locked overnight. She also used a small recorder and captured a faint scraping noise late one evening during cleanup. The sound resembled metal dragging at irregular intervals, and she could not trace it to any equipment. On her next day off, Lois visited the county records office to compare old structural plans with the modern layout. She located a blueprint from the early 1980s that showed a narrow cleaning room extending several feet beyond the current basement wall. A retired inspector sitting nearby overheard her questions and recognized the building. He explained that the room had been sealed during a renovation in 1987 due to moisture issues and shifting foundation supports. The official notes recorded basic reinforcement, yet his memory included louder cracks and strange drafts that workers complained about during demolition. Everything connected during a late closing shift when Lois heard a steady knock from the far corner where the sealed room once existed. She pushed stacked soda crates aside and found a thin crack running along the concrete floor that released a cold draft. She pressed on the wall above it and felt the drywall flex gently, revealing a hollow echo that matched the older blueprint. She used her flashlight and spotted a collapsed wooden brace, broken shelving, and a metal latch coated with dust, except for one clean streak suggesting recent contact. The next morning, she told the manager, who immediately hired a contractor to evaluate the area because the structure sounded compromised. The contractor removed a segment of drywall and uncovered a narrow void crowded with old cleaning tools, broken brackets, and a rusted track from a discontinued freezer unit that once belonged to the diner. He said years of temperature swings had likely weakened the braces, which allowed the debris to shift and create the knocking sounds. However, he pointed out that the freezer latch had clean scrape marks too fresh to be from the 1980s. As work continued, the contractor reinforced the corner and sealed the gaps that had caused the drafts. The scraping noise disappeared from Lois's recordings, and the cans on the shelves remained stable for the first time in weeks. Lois kept working at the diner, yet avoided the far corner whenever possible, choosing to handle most prep tasks upstairs unless her shift required inventory checks. Despite the repairs, small inconsistencies still bothered Lois as she reviewed her earlier notes. The handwriting on the clipboard never matched any employee. The delivery driver said his early thump sounded heavier than shifting debris. The dishwasher's burnt smell did not match failing wiring or equipment. Even the manager admitted he could not explain how the clipboard left a locked drawer unless the drawer stuck open the night before, though Lois never experienced a jam with that drawer. These loose details kept the case alive in local conversations, especially when new employees arrived. Many treated the incident as a grounded reminder that old buildings sometimes expose forgotten parts of their structure in unsettling ways. Older staff members said the basement behaved strangely during temperature swings, and that the sealed room probably shifted more than anyone expected after years of trapped air settling behind the wall. Lois eventually accepted a cooking position in a neighboring town and said she felt relief leaving the basement behind. She explained to coworkers that the room had changed before anyone noticed, as if the structure signaled its problems long before the crack appeared. She never claimed anything supernatural and believed the shifting evidence reflected the natural effects of age, pressure, and forgotten construction choices. Still, she kept the recorder, the photographs, and the clipboard note. She stored them together in a small box because she felt the documents captured a moment where simple daily work collided with reminders of a hidden room that had not been touched for decades. The case never reached beyond local memory, yet the details lingered among those who worked at the diner, shaping a story about an old basement that turned routine tasks into something unsettling but firmly grounded in reality. People in town still talk about the 1995 basement incident because it shows how a single crack and a few quiet noises can alter the mood of an entire workplace. Staff members agree the building never meant to frighten anyone, yet the sealed room carried its forgotten history into the present and left enough unanswered questions to keep the story alive. The stories buried in primitive forest. Ranger logs reportedly described a quiet case that started after bones were discovered deep inside a primitive forest in remote Australia during winter of 1970. Officers treated the findings seriously because earlier files mentioned bushwalkers who vanished near the same ridge without reliable tracks or confirmed final sightings. The forest carried a reputation for swallowing evidence quickly due to harsh winds that erased prints faster than officers could follow them across narrow corridors. Tavin Rook, a 34-year-old survey assistant, entered that forest early one morning with a plan to update boundary sketches for a rural land office that operated from a distant cattle station. He carried a film camera, a compass, a canvas pouch filled with markers, and a worn notebook passed down from a retired mapper who once worked the same track. His routine involved walking slowly through thick scrub while checking soil patterns that shifted every winter due to strong seasonal wind. He expected another long but predictable day that would end with him returning before the sun dropped behind the ridge. The first sign of trouble appeared when Tavin noticed a section of brush flattened in a way that did not match natural storm damage or animal movement around known feeding paths. He stepped through the opening and found a shallow pit scraped into the soil, and inside the pit lay pale fragments scattered among dark ash. A faint, burnt smell drifted above the disturbed earth, which made him pause while studying straight edges along several fragments. He tied cloth tape to a branch, then walked toward a nearby ridge where radio reception sometimes improved enough for a short call. Two officers arrived a few hours later and followed Tavin back to the site using careful, measured steps because the surrounding ground felt soft enough to collapse under sudden weight. They crouched near the pit and wrote in their logs that the fragments did not resemble cattle remains, usually scattered by predators. One officer pointed out the pit's smooth inner arc, which suggested deliberate shaping rather than random erosion caused by runoff. Tavin told them he had passed this area several times without seeing any clearing, which gave the discovery an unsettling quality that none of them could ignore. Investigators returned the next morning with canvas bags, wooden stakes, a measuring rope, and a hand-drawn grid used to record distances around features that might hold evidence. Tavin guided them across cold undergrowth that rattled under shallow gusts blowing down from taller trees near the ridge. They soon uncovered two additional pits positioned roughly 100 meters from the first, and each contained bone fragments mixed with ash and small pieces of scorched canvas cloth. A retired boundary rider named Brant Hiller approached after noticing their camp and said he once saw strange holes near this ridge in 1969 while searching for a wandering steer. Forensic staff examined the fragments inside a tent anchored with heavy stones because winter wind often pulled stakes loose from thin soil. They identified several pieces bearing narrow cut marks created by a small blade and noted that the cuts remained sharp despite expected weathering. They studied the ash and believed the burnt cloth fibers matched material used in canvas pouches common among bushwalkers during that era. Tavin provided photographs taken before the pits were disturbed, and analysts noticed a consistent curved outline surrounding each circle, which indicated repeated actions performed with steady hand pressure. Investigators opened metal boxes containing older missing person files stored at their outpost and found two cases involving bushwalkers reported missing near the ridge during the late 1960s. Search teams at the time mentioned rapid storms that erased footprints moments after they were discovered. The lack of final sightings made the earlier investigations impossible to complete, which left unanswered questions lingering alongside heavy doubt. Officers believed the new pits might relate to those older files, but lacked direct evidence to support a solid conclusion. The case changed direction when a station rider delivered a tin he found lodged between stones inside a shallow creek flowing away from the ridge. Inside the tin were scraps of paper listing dates that matched the two disappearance cases, along with a short message describing faint shouting heard near the ridge on a cold night in 1969. A small wooden carving rested under the papers and carried blade strokes identical to cut marks found on fragments recovered from the earliest pit. Investigators believed the carving held significance because its shape matched outlines traced in the soil around each site. Tavin expanded his boundary sketches, and investigators used his drawings to outline a rough path forming a diagonal line between the three pits. That line followed an abandoned stock track no longer used by station workers because shifting soil made the route unstable during winter. Officers searched branches and brush along the path and discovered faint cuts on exposed wood that matched the tool marks found on the fragments. Those signs confirmed the unknown figure moved through the region recently and possibly returned several times in a pattern none of them fully understood. Investigators traveled to a small settlement near the outer track and asked local shopkeepers whether they remembered strangers buying tools suited for remote travel. A hardware clerk recalled a quiet man who purchased a sharpening stone, twine, and a small blade before asking about forgotten bridle routes often used by older drovers. The clerk said the man carried an old canvas pack and looked exhausted, as if he had walked across long stretches of harsh land without rest. The description lacked finer detail, but gave investigators a direction that matched the evidence collected earlier. One evening, a stockman passing the ridge reported seeing a faint lantern weaving between trees just after the sun dipped behind the ridge when cold air settled thick across the ground. Officers followed his description and reached the area before dawn, carrying kerosene lamps because torches drained too quickly in cold weather common to that region. They stepped carefully along soft patches of soil and found shallow boot impressions following a narrow corridor that led toward the first pit. Those prints held enough detail to confirm recent travel, which gave them confidence that the figure remained nearby. They found a man standing near the pit with a canvas sack resting near his feet. He did not run and answered questions with quiet, steady voice. He said he walked through the forest trying to retrace steps taken by his older cousin who disappeared in 1969 after leaving for a bushwalk across the ridge. He explained that he discovered a locked trunk inside an unused shed on his family property, which held a journal filled with rough sketches resembling the wooden carving found inside the creek den. He admitted he did not fully understand the symbols, but believed recreating the shapes might help him follow the same path his cousin walked before the storm arrived. Officers verified his account and confirmed the disappearance file described a sudden weather shift that halted searching during the final hours of daylight. They checked the bone fragments again and found no signs of recent trauma, which indicated the remains belonged to much older material scattered across the forest long before the man built the pits. Investigators released him because he had not harmed anyone and advised him to avoid further digging because conditions across the ridge turned unpredictable during winter storms. Tavin returned several days later to complete his boundary sketches and saw the pits already filling with fallen leaves pushed by steady wind that swept through every afternoon. The forest reclaimed disturbed ground quickly, which reminded him how evidence vanished under natural pressure long before investigators could draw solid conclusions. Officers closed their temporary camp and stored all collected items inside metal cabinets at their outpost where earlier files had already gathered dust. The missing person cases remained unresolved because the harsh climate erased crucial traces faster than any team could preserve them. Tavin believed the discovery highlighted how silence shaped the forest more strongly than any recorded log or measured grid. He thought the scattered bones and carved patterns showed how unanswered questions survived through decades, even when every physical clue seemed buried. He carried those thoughts each time he walked the ridge because the land felt heavy with old stories that refused to surface clearly, despite every careful step taken through tight corridors shaped by cold, relentless wind.
The stories of strange soil discoveries tied to one vanished technician. It started as a case that deputies in Western Washington quietly described as one of the strangest clothing-related incidents tied to a missing person report. The focus centered on a jacket that appeared in multiple places and carried objects that did not belong to its owner, which pushed investigators into an unusual line of questioning. Darren Kessler was a 33-year-old maintenance tech who lived in a small community near the foothills west of Olympia. He planned a simple Saturday check on an aging pump station that sat near an overgrown trail because he wanted to finish a repair before heavy rain came. He lived alone and usually contacted his supervisor after each job, but that call never arrived, which became the first sign that something was wrong. He left his rental house a little after 3, according to a neighbor who heard his truck start and saw him roll toward the tree line at the end of the road. The weather was steady with low clouds and light wind, but no alerts for storms or flooding that afternoon. Darren kept his routine tight and rarely made surprise stops, which made the later discoveries even harder to explain. Around 6, a hiker contacted a dispatcher and said a truck was parked near a narrow service gate with a jacket lying on the gravel beside the driver door. The caller said the jacket looked neatly arranged, which felt odd because the ground was damp after a brief shower.
Deputies arrived 20 minutes later and found the truck unlocked yet untouched and the jacket resting in a way that looked intentional. The jacket contained a small cloth pouch filled with dirt that did not match soil from the service road or the pump station path. A deputy who had grown up in the area said the dirt looked darker and heavier, which suggested it came from a shaded environment, like a forest floor near older ground. The jacket also held a small twig bundle wrapped with fishing line, even though Darren did not fish or camp, according to family comments. Deputies swept the woods and followed the trail leading toward the pump station, but found no footprints that matched Darren's boots. The rain should have softened the ground enough to capture clear impressions, but only scattered marks from deer showed up near the main path. Darren's phone sat inside the truck with the battery nearly empty, and his work notes were missing, which created an early gap in the timeline. The search expanded the next morning when a volunteer found the same jacket placed on top of a mossy stump 200 yards from the first site. The jacket was clean again and held a handful of fine, dark soil that investigators later compared with samples from a shaded hilltop cemetery located nearly a mile east of the pump station. The match was not perfect, but close enough that deputies described it as consistent with older burial ground soil, according to the lab summary. Witness statements from two trail runners added another detail. They said they saw a man with Darren's build near the cemetery boundary fence around 4 that afternoon. They reported that he moved slowly and kept looking toward the ground as if he was trying to track something. They also said he wore no jacket, even though temperatures dropped noticeably after the rain. The discovery of cemetery soil raised concern that someone might have carried the jacket through multiple locations before leaving it in places that did not match Darren's work route. Investigators reviewed archived maintenance logs and found that Darren had flagged the pump station area for structural noise a week earlier, which suggested he knew the terrain well. They did not find anything linking him to the cemetery or to soil collection of any kind. On the third day, search teams followed a narrow drainage cut that ran behind the cemetery fence and dropped toward a shallow creek. Near the creek, they found a patch of disturbed ground where someone recently stepped into soft mud and slid while trying to climb the bank. A boot print matched Darren's approximate size, but the stride pattern suggested slow, careful movement rather than frantic escape. Another jacket discovery surfaced on the fourth day when a county worker clearing debris along a forest road found it folded on a flat rock near a turnout. This time, the jacket held dried clumps of soil mixed with thin strands of grass that did not match local vegetation. The grass type appeared similar to samples collected from an older gravesite on the cemetery's western edge, which showed a mix of native and planted species. Deputies checked a wildlife camera located near the forest road and found a recording from just after 2 in the morning. The footage reportedly showed a figure walking toward the turnout with slow, deliberate steps. The figure placed something on the rock, then moved back toward the trees before the recording cut due to battery drain. The figure's height and build roughly matched Darren, but the resolution was too poor for a firm identification. Investigators accessed archived calls from earlier years and found a missing person report from 2017 involving a man who disappeared near the same cemetery and left his jacket on a fence post. That man returned home 2 days later and told deputies he had followed what he believed were unusual animal tracks toward the creek. He said he felt disoriented during the walk and remembered placing his jacket down because he felt overheated despite the cold weather. The comparison case made investigators wonder if the area created confusing conditions for people who wandered off the main trail. A detective familiar with search patterns in western Washington noted that mixed terrain, low light, and patchy fog can distort distance perception, which might cause people to misjudge their direction. That explanation fit some pieces, but did not explain why the jacket kept reappearing with soil from several locations. On the sixth day, a volunteer found Darren's work notebook wedged between roots near the northern path that led toward the hilltop cemetery. The last entry mentioned a faint humming sound near the pump station that he wanted to check before the next week's inspection. The notebook also held a small smear of the same dark soil found in the jacket, which strengthened the connection between the sites.
Search teams focused their efforts near the cemetery hilltop and the creek bend, but found no further belongings. The sheriff's office described the soil-filled jacket pattern as one of the most confounding sequences they had seen in recent years, because the placement of each item suggested deliberate movement, but the surrounding terrain showed no full, matching footprints. Deputies considered the possibility that Darren became disoriented and carried soil from multiple spots without clear purpose. The official report eventually summarized that Darren likely walked between the pump station, the creek bend, and the cemetery area while experiencing severe confusion, possibly linked to sudden cold exposure or fatigue. Investigators believed he placed his jacket repeatedly because the weight of the soil-filled pouch became uncomfortable during long periods of wandering. They noted that the objects found in the jacket did not point to criminal involvement and matched natural materials available along the route. Months later, the sheriff's office issued a quiet update stating that Darren remained listed as missing and the investigation stayed open for periodic review. They encouraged hikers to report new findings because heavy winter rain can reveal items hidden under debris. People in the nearby communities still talk about the case because the soil-filled jacket recoveries created a pattern that seemed intentional yet lacked clear explanation. In the end, the story settled into local memory as a reminder that even familiar trails can turn unpredictable when weather shifts and visibility drops in the dense forests of western Washington. Investigators still use parts of the case during training sessions to show how scattered evidence can mislead search teams in wooded terrain. Darren's family continues to hope for answers and says the strange jacket discoveries may reflect his final attempts to trace a path back toward home. The story's hidden inside an abandoned playroom that terrified an entire street. It started with a forgotten playroom in a quiet Midwest neighborhood that residents said held nothing unusual, yet archived calls from the late 1990s linked it to repeated disturbances that never made local papers. The street had grown used to routine issues in that era, but that dusty room reportedly pushed everything toward one final discovery that no one expected. In early spring of 1997, 33-year-old Lucia Morente returned to her childhood block in a modest Illinois suburb after several years away. She worked as a freelance home organizer and came back to help her aunt clear an old rental house that sat near the end of a sleepy cul-de-sac. That place had been vacant since 1996, and Lucia hoped one calm day of sorting would finish the job without surprises. Her plan shifted once she stepped into the dim living room and noticed faint scrape marks running across the hallway floor. She followed them toward the door of a small playroom she barely remembered from her teenage visits. Someone had pushed a heavy dresser against that doorway many years earlier, and her aunt claimed the final tenants did it after odd noises came from that space during several winter nights. Lucia moved the dresser and felt cool. Stale air drift into the hall as she opened the door. The small room looked simple, with faded wallpaper and a cracked window, yet several objects sat stacked near the back corner. There were 3 plastic toys, a cheap camera from a discount store, and a folded coloring sheet that looked newer than the surrounding dust. It confused her because her aunt said no children lived there after 1993. She stepped closer and saw the coloring sheet showed a rough drawing of the same house, with uneven squares representing windows. A scribbled figure stood in the yard, and a date written along the bottom read 1995 in a childlike scrawl. That date contradicted every memory her aunt had about the quiet couple who last rented the place. Her aunt arrived a moment later and paused when she heard Lucia mention the sheet. She said the couple stayed only a few months and kept mostly to themselves, and she remembered no children visiting. Lucia examined the toy camera, which felt cheap yet carried a tiny memory card that looked like a late 90s aftermarket upgrade. She called a friend named Rafe Mendez, a 36-year-old local tech repair worker, and asked him to review the files. Rafe met her at the house that afternoon and noticed the playroom felt strangely untouched, almost like someone closed the door in 1996 and never returned. He connected the memory card to his small laptop and found several blurred image files dated between late 1995 and early 1996. The first images showed random views of the peeling wallpaper. The next showed a dark figure near the hallway doorway that raised questions about who held the camera. Lucia wanted to check the official timeline, so she reviewed her aunt's old rental notes. Those notes listed only one couple during 1995 and 1996, and neither mentioned children. The notes referenced a small maintenance request about tapping noises near the back rooms, but no follow-up existed. The request carried a winter timestamp from 1996 that matched the final images on the card. She visited a neighbor named Elvio Saran, a man in his 50s who had lived across the street since the early 80s. He remembered the renters keeping their blinds shut and rarely leaving the house, and he reportedly saw a small figure near the back window once during a snowy night. He assumed it was a relative visiting, but he never saw that person again. He could not confirm if it was a child or a very small adult, which added further uncertainty. Lucia asked if any police calls were made back then. Elvio said the street filed one noise complaint in early 1996 due to loud banging near the abandoned yard behind the house. She checked public logs stored at the town office and found a single report describing unexplained pounding heard by several homes. Officers responded and found no one, ending the call after a brief check. When Lucia returned to the playroom, she inspected the cracked window more carefully. Dirt streaks covered the glass, and a faint handprint appeared near the lower corner. She pressed her hand next to it and saw the print was noticeably smaller. Something about the reach suggested a child tried to push upward from inside the room. The detail unsettled her, and she stepped away to regain composure. Rafe enlarged one particular image and found a blurred figure seated on the floor. The angle implied a child took the photo, yet the floor looked cleaner than its current dusty state. That inconsistency hinted the room had been used far longer than the record suggested. Lucia searched again and found a small, folded note wedged under a loose baseboard. It read, "I hear him at night," in shaky pencil handwriting, and the edges were brittle from age. She brought the note to Rafe, who said the writing looked young and uneven. The vague pronoun raised questions, since it could refer to a father or an unknown visitor. Lucia checked archived missing person reports from nearby Illinois towns during 1995 and 1996. No direct matches surfaced, yet one brief entry mentioned a relative who left home unexpectedly around that time but returned months later with few details given. To understand the neighborhood context, she visited another longtime resident named Marla Denor, a retired woman who remembered muffled crying during 2 winter nights in 1996. She never reported it because she assumed the couple argued, yet she never saw anyone leaving the house during those tense periods. Her memory offered no confirmation, only a piece of local atmosphere that fit the timeline. The next morning, Lucia returned to take final photos of the room. Sunlight angled through the cracked window and revealed faint chalk lines on the wooden floor. The lines formed shapes that looked like a simple game pattern. One longer line pointed toward the wall facing the backyard shed, a weathered structure that had not been maintained since the early 90s. Lucia walked outside and examined that shed, noticing its back panel had newer wood on one side. She asked her aunt if anyone repaired the shed during those years. Her aunt said no contractor touched it since 1992 because the original owner moved away. Lucia studied the panel and saw thin braces holding cracked wood together, as if someone pushed from inside many years earlier. She pulled gently and saw a small, hollow space behind the panel containing a plastic ring, the cheap kind sold in grocery toy machines across the Midwest in that decade. The ring size matched the small handprint in the playroom. Lucia felt a cold pause while considering the timeline. She gave the ring and the memory card to an officer at the small precinct desk. The officer promised a routine check and called 2 days later with a brief summary. He said the items aligned with an old welfare inquiry from 1996 involving a teenage relative of the renters. The teen reportedly stayed with them briefly after leaving a stressful home environment. No criminal case emerged, and the teen eventually moved to another state for schooling. The explanation left gaps, yet it offered the first official thread connecting the chalk marks, the shaky drawings, and the hidden ring. Lucia believed the playroom served as a temporary refuge for someone who felt unsafe and tried to stay unnoticed. The dark figure in the camera images might have been one of the adults checking on the teen during tense nights. The noisier incidents likely came from the shed when the teen attempted to hide from arguments rather than from any unknown visitor. Lucia helped her aunt finish clearing the house by the end of the week. She boxed the old toys and cleaned the playroom gently, wanting to close the chapter without leaving anything that suggested fear lingered there. As she locked the door, she thought about how a quiet Illinois street in the late 1990s missed the subtle distress inside that house. Nothing supernatural lived in that room, only signs of a young person dealing with isolation and limited choices during a difficult chapter. The house later sold to a new family, and neighbors said the block felt calmer once new voices filled the yard. For Lucia, the discovery of the playroom became a reminder that even neglected rooms can reveal long buried struggles. She left the street with a steady sense of closure, convinced that the forgotten space finally released its quiet truth.
The stories behind a remote Appalachian stop that people avoided for years. A decades-old warning about a forgotten mountain pull-in still circulates quietly among people who grew up near that stretch of the eastern ridgeline. The story gained new attention after a small investigation in the late 1990s uncovered details that had never been shared outside a few regional reports. In the summer of 1996, a 33-year-old delivery tech named Carver Hensley drove through a rural section of Appalachia on his way to install hardware at a small clinic. He lived in a nearby township and took that route often, and he usually stopped at a rundown service pull-in that sat a few miles off the main road. He planned to grab a quick snack that morning, check a tire that had been losing pressure, and continued toward his client. The pull-in was an old gravel loop beside a closed diner, and most drivers ignored it. That day, Carver noticed an unfamiliar sedan parked near the tree line. He saw no one around, and he assumed the driver had stepped into the woods. He locked his truck, checked his tire, and walked toward the diner door to lean into the patch of shade by the boarded windows. As he approached the building, he heard a brief metallic sound coming from behind the diner. It was sharp and irregular, and it made him stop halfway across the gravel. He called out to check if someone needed help, but no one responded. He moved closer to the sound, and the air smelled stale, as if something had been sitting there for a long time. He rounded the corner and saw an electrical panel on the back wall hanging open. The wires were exposed and looked recently disturbed. Carver stepped back and noticed faint drag marks on the ground near the panel. The marks looked fresh, and he felt uneasy, so he walked back to his truck. Before he reached it, he saw movement inside the other sedan. A figure sat up in the driver's seat, then ducked down. He paused and whispered a short question toward the vehicle, but the figure stayed low. He reached for his door handle, then stopped when the sedan horn chirped as if someone had pressed it lightly. He left the pull-in and drove to the nearest gas station with cell service. He made a call to the county sheriff office and reported what he saw. A deputy named Rowan Kincaid met him at the station, took notes, and followed him back to the pull-in. When they arrived, the sedan was gone. The open electrical panel was still there, and the drag marks remained faintly visible. Deputy Kincaid walked the area carefully. He found a torn piece of cloth caught on a bent screw near the panel. It looked like worn jacket fabric. He also found a small stack of motel matchbooks shoved into a narrow gap under the diner siding. Carver had never seen those items there before, and he told Kincaid exactly how the pull-in usually looked on his previous visits. The deputy requested a quick records check on recent missing persons from nearby counties. He also called for a technician to capture basic photos of the panel and the marks. Carver waited by his truck as the technician moved around the building. During that search, a second sedan slowed on the main road and paused near the entrance. The driver looked toward the diner, then sped off. The deputy marked the detail in his notes and later tried to match the description to nearby motel logs. 2 days later, investigators reviewed archived motel paperwork from a property about 15 miles south. They found a registration from early that week made under a false name. The handwriting looked similar to notes found inside the matchbooks. A clerk at the motel told them a quiet man checked in alone and asked for a room near the back lot. The clerk remembered the man driving a dark sedan with a dented left rear door. The investigators compared that detail with Carver's memory. He recalled that the sedan at the pull-in had a similar dent. The timeline fit closely. They then interviewed a hiker who reported hearing a brief argument behind the closed diner earlier that same morning. The hiker had been passing by on a nearby trail and thought the voices sounded tense, but he dismissed it at the time. Deputy Kincaid returned to the pull-in with another officer and searched a deeper patch of woods. They discovered an abandoned fire ring with half-burned papers. Some ash fragments held partial writing that matched the motel register handwriting. One charred scrap mentioned a location near a state border and a date that lined up with the day Carver passed through. Investigators believed the person in the sedan had been trying to dispose of notes before leaving the area. About a week later, state police tracked a vehicle matching the same description to a roadside rest area in another county. The driver had left the sedan unlocked. Inside, officers found a backpack containing old receipts, a map with several marked pull ins, and a small cassette recorder wrapped in a towel. The recorder held a short clip of ambient noise that sounded like the electrical panel at the diner. It also captured a faint second voice near the end of the clip. Analysts could not identify the speaker, though the tone suggested strain and the words were unclear. Investigators linked the sedan driver to a minor fraud case from the early 1990s involving a stolen identity. Records indicated he had moved through several remote towns using different aliases. Most of the items found at the pull-in fit a pattern of brief stays, quiet exits, and scattered notes found later by accident. Officials concluded he likely panicked when he saw Carver, tried to hide, then left quickly, leaving behind evidence of unrelated activity that he never intended to expose. Carver continued his work route after the incident, and he later told a colleague that he avoided the pull-in from that point forward. The diner remained closed for years, and the electrical panel was eventually removed when the property changed hands in 2005. Local deputies still reference the case when warning drivers about isolated stops on older mountain roads. They note that small places can attract people who want to stay unnoticed, and the signs are often visible only to someone who pauses long enough to notice something out of place. The pull-in sits empty today, and most travelers pass without slowing down. The warning stays alive, mostly through brief mentions during safety briefings and quiet stories shared by people who remember that summer. They describe it as a reminder that ordinary stops can shift quickly when someone with hidden plans crosses paths with the wrong witness at the wrong moment.
The story is about the lake house photo that proved a hidden guest. Archived Ranger notes from a quiet lake region in Mississippi described a cluster of odd reports during the late 1990s. Locals later said the trouble truly began when a single vacation photo surfaced with something in the background that did not belong there at all. Caden Markell was 29 and worked as a part-time survey analyst for a small mapping contractor, and he usually took quick weekend trips to check shoreline markers. He arrived at a rented lake house near a narrow Mississippi inlet that stayed calm even during rough weather, and he expected a simple 2-day assignment. His plan was to photograph the shoreline, record a few maintenance notes, then leave before the second night. The first morning felt predictable. He walked along the dock with his camera, wrote brief notes in a small notebook, and stayed focused on his routine. A neighbor named Rhoda Bexley waved from the porch of her cabin and shouted a short greeting that sounded friendly enough for a quiet lakeside community. Caden noted her presence because it confirmed that he was not isolated, and he appreciated the normalcy. The incident started when he reviewed the afternoon photos inside the lake house. One image taken near the shoreline showed a faint human shape behind him in the tree line. He knew he had been alone in that spot, and the sight of the figure created a tense confusion that he could not explain. The shape looked too defined to be a trick of light, and he decided to walk outside to compare the tree line directly. He followed the narrow path behind the house and checked the soil for fresh impressions. The ground held soft patches of damp leaves mixed with thin mud that captured footprints clearly, and he spotted a partial print near a fallen branch. The tread pattern did not match his own boots, and the impression felt recent enough to unsettle him. Rhoda had mentioned weekend hikers during earlier conversations, yet the print shape felt sharper and more deliberate than a casual visitor. Later that evening, he met Rhoda at the property line and showed her the strange photo. Her expression tightened into a slow frown, and she said she had not seen anyone behind the rental during the day. She added that a few cabins had been entered during past off-seasons, and her voice suggested mild concern rather than fear. Caden returned to the lake house with more questions than answers. The next morning, he began a structured investigation with calm focus. He examined each photo in sequence and noticed that only a single image showed the figure. The shots taken seconds before and after looked completely normal.
He wrote time and location notes in his journal to keep everything clear, then walked toward an older shed used for storing broken lake markers. The shed door latch hung open in a way that felt careless for a managed property. Inside the shed, he found a damp jacket resting on a crate. The fabric looked heavily worn, and the inner tag carried a local lake identification printed in 1994. He did not recognize the jacket from any earlier visits. He photographed the tag, backed out of the shed, and noted the stale air inside. The evidence did not prove someone had been present that same day, yet the loose latch and fresh footprint created a pattern he could not ignore. Midday brought him to a small ranger outpost across the narrow lakeside road. The ranger on duty, Kellen Rourke, studied the photo carefully before mentioning an old case from 2001 involving a missing traveler. He made it clear he could not confirm any connection, yet he pointed toward a binder filled with archived sightings from the late 1990s. Several notes described a quiet figure who moved between empty Mississippi cabins at night, and each report used cautious language rather than firm conclusions. Caden returned to the rental and inspected the interior with careful attention. The back window frame showed thin scratches that lined up with a tool rather than natural wear, and he photographed the marks before checking the loft bedroom. Near the bed, he found a small compression in the carpet, almost like someone had knelt there recently. The texture difference felt fresh enough to raise concern. He arranged his evidence on the dining table. The footprint photo, the jacket tag picture, and the window scratch image lined up in a way that hinted at quiet entry rather than random activity. The footprint angle suggested movement toward the lake house, the jacket tag implied familiarity with the area, and the window marks suggested someone tested or used the entrance. The reflection in the original photo appeared more intentional when viewed alongside these clues. During the afternoon, he returned to the tree line to check the lighting angles that shaped the original reflection. Behind a birch tree, he found another partial print that matched the first one. A set of snapped twigs pointed toward a narrow footpath leading deeper into the woods, and the soil showed signs of someone moving with quick steps. Caden stayed on the main trail for safety and avoided the smaller path entirely. Back inside the rental, he reviewed a final batch of photos and made a critical observation. He realized the figure in the original image did not stand upright. When he studied the shadows and angles, he saw that the shape aligned with someone crouched low, almost hiding behind the tree line while watching him. The height matched the indentation beside the loft bed, which connected the outside presence with possible entry inside the house. He brought this conclusion to Ranger Rourke the next morning, and the ranger filed a general incident note. The ranger said older logs mentioned a lone transient who survived around the lake for years by entering empty cabins during slow seasons. The reports described a nonviolent individual who avoided direct contact and moved silently between tree lines. Rourke emphasized that none of this confirmed a match, yet he said the pattern felt familiar. Caden left the lake house that afternoon with a steady pace and one last look at the quiet inlet. His final photo showed nothing unusual, yet he held the camera low as a small precaution. He shared his findings with the property manager, who mentioned that other renters had reported odd feelings during late-season visits. They accepted his evidence for their internal records. In the years that followed, the photo circulated quietly among Mississippi lake workers as an example of how easily a hidden person could observe without notice. A few workers claimed similar sightings in later seasons, but no clear proof ever surfaced. Caden kept a personal copy of the image stored in his office drawer and reviewed it from time to time. The tension he once felt shifted into a calmer understanding of how silent places can hide watchful guests. He later said the experience changed his approach to isolated locations. Every quiet structure could mask someone moving with patience, and every reflection could reveal something that stood just outside his awareness. The lake house incident never escalated into danger, yet the clues pointed towards someone who stayed much closer than anyone realized.